All right, let's clap and sync up. So 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Cool. That's that. Yeah.
Welcome back to the Great and Secret Knowledge.
I think we could do better than that.
We haven't come up with any intros or outros yet.
Lindsay.
Jeff.
This is the Great and Secret Knowledge.
Yes, it is. And we are wrapping up our discussion of Piranesi in this episode.
Hell yeah. So the last chapter, it's really short. It's called Matthew Rose Sorensen. And yeah, this is going to be really short, so we'll spend some time talking about the book as a whole once we're done with the main coverage. Any preliminary thoughts about this chapter specifically?
I know that the ending of this book can be quite divisive. I know people who really don't like it, but I feel like it is an appropriate end to this novel. I think that way it answers some, but not all of the questions raised by the novel. It leaves you in a place of transition, but it doesn't just leave you, I think is a nice epilogue for the story.
Yeah, I rounded up a bunch of 1-star reviews. I figure we'll look through those after our chat about that.
I do think is an interesting idea for a segment when we finish up a property, because obviously we like it and we think it's good, or we wouldn't be talking about it, right? We at least think it's compelling, or we wouldn't be talking about it. So you know that we probably stand on the this is a good work of fiction side of things. But it'd be interesting to read some dissenting opinions and see what some other people have to say about it.
Yeah, and this all came about because I went to Threads. It said something like, I don't get why people do 1-star reviews. Like, if you don't like it that much, just keep it to yourself.
I mean...
And everyone and her mother came out to tell me why that was dumb. And so then I went to the 1-star reviews for Piranesi, and I was like, holy shit. Like, if you're not sure you like a book or will like a book, that's a great place to start, because they'll tell you all the things that may or may not be not to your liking.
Right. I think as a person who has to live as an rate E of the 5-star system, because my gelato shop gets rated online all the time, so I have to read people's thoughts about, my work. But I do understand that, people want to communicate their experience, and if maybe tip you off about something that isn't for you, Yeah. I don't like the people who say that this is a universally horrible thing, because, like, that's just your feeling. But everybody is entitled to their opinions. Man. And that is the point of leaving a review, is to try and communicate something to other people who may or may not be partaking in this thing, right? And they want to get an idea. Like, I definitely, even though I am subject to Yelp and Google Places reviews, I look at them when I'm trying to find a restaurant, in an area I'm unfamiliar with, so.
Yeah.
I've learned,
And usually I'll look at a review ahead of time, which I didn't do for Piranesi, right? Because I love it. So going after the fact was really interesting, especially having done what we've already done, covered it in detail.
Yeah, talked about it thoroughly. But if I know I'm interested in a thing, I try not to look at any reviews. Reviews for me are only if I'm deciding if I'm interested in a thing or not.
Right.
Might read them after to see what other people thought, but like if I know I'm already interested in something, then I try not to see any additional information about it until I've excuse me, read or watched it or what have you.
Cool. I'm glad we're on the same page.
So
I'm sorry. I should respond to that instead of rushing forward.
No. I'm just warning you. That was just I have the hiccups, so I'm sorry if they intrude further. My diaphragm was interrupting.
Oh my God, I hate the hiccups.
So yeah, the hiccups.
When they happen to me, not you. I'm not judging you for a normal biological function. We were talking about your overall feelings about the chapter. It's divisive. It's an ending. But some people feel it's too abrupt, maybe?
Too abrupt, too vague. Like, it's not... but I don't think it's vague at all. I mean, it doesn't... He's still in an in-between transitional place, right? He is no longer completely Piranesi, but he is also not Matthew Sorensen again either. He's living in kind of an in-between place where he's now multiple people at the same time. So I can see some people finding that unsatisfying, but most people's stories don't just stop at a convenient point, you know?
Well, we will get into that at the end, once we're done talking about the chapter, because, I have feelings about it too. I think that a good ending encompasses or encapsulates everything that came before. Maybe it even is like mirroring the beginning. You know, there's a lot to it. Yeah.
And I think this ending is appropriate for this story. Like, it wouldn't be a good ending for every book, but for the story that just preceded it, I think it's appropriate.
Yeah, and opposed to Stephen King's it's not a big giant spider. So, it's got that going for it.
We could go into a whole side diatribe right now about how Stephen King keeps trying to write Lovecraftian horror, but likes to end his books with a concrete good and evil battle. And you can't do that with unknowable, unquantifiable things, so he always has to quantify it right there at the end, and it's almost always a letdown.
Yeah.
And it being the, prototypical example of that.
Yeah. That's why. Oh my God. Is there a worse ending to a really great story? I can't think of one.
I mean, I'm sure there is, but it has got to be up there in one of the most, this is a really good story that has a really unsatisfying ending.
Yes. Okay, so let's head on in. First part is Valentine Ketterly has disappeared. So Ketterly's missing. The cops are trying to find him. They ask people that knew him. No one remembers him being a boat guy, like an outdoor guy. So they're confused as to why he bought that stuff.
The equipment he purchased right at the end, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, he's definitely not a boat guy. His lack of boat guyness is part of his downfall.
Yeah, if he had just gone on boats and stayed out of the house.
If he had upped his proficiency in boats, then he might have survived. But no.
Oh, you're saying if he had some practice.
Boat skill.
Then
he might have survived the flood. But because he was deeply unboat guy, he did not.
Oh my God. You gotta prepare. I guess he didn't know the flood was coming until it was only a few days away, so.
Yeah, he didn't have time to formulate that much of a... He had a couple days. I think he could have done better.
He did get a gun, though, and he practiced the gun.
He practiced with the gun, but that's because he was already intent on killing 16 way before he knew about the flood.
Yeah.
As soon as she started poking around, he was thinking about killing her, so... We're not sad his lack of boat skills did him in, is what we're saying.
Not at all. That guy was a jerk. All right, we meet Officer Askill, and he thinks Ketterly's disappearance is related to the reappearance of Matthew Rose Sorensen. Mm-hmm. He thinks that Ketterly held Sorensen to do what Arn Sales did, or what they think Arn Sales did, to manufacture evidence of
Right.
this other world.
To, like, drug them or brainwash them or whatever into being corroborating witnesses to the other world.
Right. And then he thinks that he killed himself out of shame, or maybe because they were closing in on him.
I mean, that is the thing lots of people do when they're going to get caught.
Yeah. Where the theory falls down is that neither Arnsales nor Ketterly ever used the disappearances as evidence of anything. In fact, for many years, Ketterly had been loud in his denunciation of Arnsales. Yeah. It's just interesting that, like, the cops never really knew who these guys were. You know, like, and it makes sense because, like, there's so much, because of all the crime TV shows, the FBI shows, like, we think of, like, the cops are in there doing psychological profiles, you know, Agent Mulder's going over their childhoods. But really,
we talked about
just
this a little bit, in the last episode, about the fact that, like, propaganda has led people to believe that the police force, law enforcement in general, is way more efficacious than they actually are. Like, 2% of crimes is what the police force... I don't know why I was phrased that like I was Yoda, but the police solve about 2% of all crime.
Solve 2%? They do.
Yeah, I don't know why I said that like Yoda. But they only solve 2% of crime, generally speaking. And so, yes, they are not generally a sort of crack. All these resources are not being devoted towards a missing person. I mean, they do imply in this that continuing to search for Matthew Rose Sorensen was kind of a personal mission of hers, you know, that it wasn't like anything that the whole force was still actively engaged in, you know.
Yeah. All right. So, next, I like this bit. Undeterred, Askill has questioned me twice. He is a young man with a pleasant, good-natured face, little brown curls all over his head, and an intelligent expression. He wears a dark blue suit and a gray shirt, and speaks with a Yorkshire accent. Just another classic Piranesi physical description. Let's see. And where were you, he asks, while you were gone? I was in a house with many rooms. The sea sweeps through the house. Sometimes it swept over me, but always I was saved. Asko pauses and frowns, and then he's like, that doesn't sound real, you know? Like, it's interesting. But this is the thing cops do, too. It's just like, if your story is at all unusual or outlandish, or, you know, if you got abducted by aliens or whatever, like, they're just going to talk you into this narrow range of what they assume is normal.
I mean, again... cops are notorious for pushing interrogations until they get at a statement that supports whatever they already thought was going on, as opposed to trying to actually uncover what actually happened. They are trying to fit things into boxes of what they've already decided happened because they want to close the case. They want to move on. As we talk about the rate of overturned coercive confessions in this country.
Oh my God, yes. And they'll push any advantage. I'm surprised they didn't push him more being emotionally compromised. You know, like in that case, what was the Netflix documentary? It was Wisconsin. The woman was killed and then burned in the fire pit. Does this ring a bell? It was like a junkyard. Anyway, the kid was 18 years old. And slow. I don't know if that's the PC way to say it, or the respectful way. Anyway,
a little developmentally impaired.
There you go. And they just grilled him for hours until they got what they wanted, and they got a conviction. That's not to say that he wasn't guilty or that his uncle
but
wasn't.
They do that a lot with people, even who don't necessarily have a neurodivergent disadvantage in an interrogation room. Like, they do that with all kinds of people. You know, you keep anybody in a room for 18 hours and don't let them sleep and don't let them, you know, then you can get most people to say a lot of stuff to get out of that room.
Yeah.
Especially when authority figures are threatening them and telling them that, like, if they don't cooperate, they're going to get more jail time and stuff.
Yeah. Maybe it's different in the UK, but here, like, this guy's clearly not guilty. Like, you know, he's been missing for years. Like, surely he wouldn't be your suspect, but they'd still fucking grill this poor bastard, like, just to find somebody they can throw in jail.
Well, and I mean, if you are the only alive person to a mysterious circumstance, then yeah, they're gonna try and want to, like, get an explanation out of you or blame you for so that they can just wrap it up.
Yeah, I do like the trope though in fiction where some crazy sci-fi shit has happened, or like horror, you know, ghosts or whatever, and they give us this scene, you know, of like, well, there were 7 bodies with their throats ripped out, and you had blood on your hands. Like, could you explain this? You know, because most movies just end at the scariest point or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, it's something I always think about and always find funny is the idea of, like, what happens in the next 24 hours a lot of times after a movie ends. I particularly like, they talked about the writers of Buffy. Part of the reason why they landed on bodies dusting, like, they called it dusting when it, like, dissolved in a poof of, you know, dust when they were staked, is because they didn't want to have to deal with, like, their protagonists cleaning up bodies for 20 minutes at the end of every episode.
It's just Dexter every week.
Yeah. You just, because realistically, if you staked it and it killed the vampire, but something didn't happen, like them dissolving in a puff of dust, then that's some real problems in a small town for your ongoing, like, characters to deal with.
Yeah, I think Giles would just have a Mr. Wolf on hand, you know, to clean the crime scenes.
I mean, one of them would
Harvey
have to get a
Keitel
job at,
comes
like,
out.
a crematorium or something, right? Like, if
Yeah.
the bodies didn't just disappear.
Hell yeah. Buffy. Is Buffy on our list? I'm gonna write it
Buffy
down.
isn't on our list. Buffy should be on our list, for
Hell
sure.
yeah. Okay. What's next? Askell asks if he's getting psychological treatment. He is. He's seeing a psychotherapist. He's not taking meds. Askell wonders if Ketterly kept him anywhere. He says no. He was free to travel. He asks if he, like, was allowed to move around. He's like, I walked for hundreds of kilometers or thousands or whatever. And he's like, that's weird. Let's see. Piranesi feels bad that he can't tell the officer more. Like, he doesn't want to disappoint people, but he also can't tell them the truth. Right? Like, he doesn't want to turn into James Ritter, right? He doesn't want to just
Yeah, and I mean, he's
say
clearly
magic
more
is real.
composed than James Ritter was. Like, James Ritter never found I mean, we've talked about James Ritter found any level of balance again by working in a building that reminded him of the house. We find out in this epilogue that Matthew Rose Sorensen helps him by bringing him back to the house and offering to bring him back whatever he wanted. But we never get the sense that James Ritter found the, like, peace and purpose that Matthew did in the house, right? So I think he was always feeling more trapped there. You know, when you hear him talk about it, he was more aware, like, he didn't forget to the same degree that he had been tricked there by Ketterly. Or no, I'm sorry, by Sorensen. Getting all the names confused, but Arnsales, that he was trapped there. So he seemed more distressed coming out of it than Matthew is. Like, Matthew is in a better place. And so I don't think he's being considered as unhinged as James Ritter was when he was brought back. So I think they're more...
You kind of shifted between Piranesi and Matthew, and I
because he's in between right now.
At some point.
Yeah. He's not really either person anymore. Yeah, but he does imply that he's not really either of those people.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Let's see. Askell says that Raphael is amazing. Piranesi agrees.
She seems pretty amazing.
Yeah, as
I will
a
also agree.
example, he tells him the story of Penny Wheeler, who was doing all this crazy stuff. Like he was throwing flaming newspaper in a church.
In a church.
She sat down with Penny Wheeler, and she got him to stop throwing flaming newspaper everywhere, and she got him to come down. I should be doing this in a Yorkshire accent, but I don't know.
Nobody's gonna make you do it.
Pretty brave, don't you think?
That's not Yorkshire.
Is that Welsh? Braver than you think, Piranesi says. She doesn't like heights. Interesting that her coworker didn't know she didn't like heights. That suggests to me that she's super humble and isn't one of those cops that like makes her biggest success like her drinking story every week. And
yeah, no, she seems to be very driven by actually like helping and reaching people. She doesn't seem to have any kind of, that's where she gets her satisfaction and her drive from, not from like being the detective on the squad with the most cases closed or the most like prestigious busts or anything. It's her actually reaching people and helping people seems to be what satisfies her. So
yeah, that's really aspirational. I know she's a cop, but if you take her out of that context,
I wish more cops were like that, but yeah, as just a person, she seems,
But like, especially in activism, I would see it all the time. The people that just put their nose to the grindstone and make sure the work is getting done and the people collaborate. And then one or two egos that are like...
Of people who need all the praise and the glory and the...
Yeah, I want people to know what I'm achieving. Yeah.
It brings up, the whole philosophical debate. If you can truly do a good act selflessly, or if because, good acts benefit us in a lot of ways in a very social, species that we are, if it's possible to do a truly like selfless good act.
Yeah, season 3 of The Good Place, if you want to learn more about that, listener.
So, yeah.
Let's see. Piranesi meets his family. They're all very happy to see him. And they're holding on to the idea that the house is a metaphor.
Mm-hmm. That it's like the way he coped with captivity or whatever they think happened to him. But
man. Wishful thinking, maybe?
Yeah, I don't know. They don't really seem to trigger any kind of more memories or response out of him, So he's happy that they're feeling better for seeing him, but, he doesn't feel any pull to them as family members or anything like that.
Yeah. That's an interesting thing that happens when people have, like, a traumatic brain injury. Or, I don't know, there's other things that can cause amnesia. But it's sad when, like, the love of their friends and family doesn't come to them. I worry about that sometimes.
Well, I will say, like, traumatic brain injuries and other ways you could, are one thing. But I've had a couple family members who've had real Alzheimer's, dementia issues and stuff like that. And for the most part, they still feel... There are times when they won't remember you, but a lot of times, even if they don't know your name, they still remember a connection with you,
Yeah. Let's see. He talks about the love of clothes. This love of clothes was something Matthew shared with Piranesi. Piranesi frequently wrote about Dr. Ketterly's clothes in his journal and lamented the contrast with his own ragged garments. But Piranesi's new personality, this joined personality, doesn't care much about clothes. What do you think about that?
I do think it's interesting that it was something that held on from Matthew through to Piranesi, but now whatever transitional stage he's in, it doesn't, You would think something that deep about you, that even when you didn't remember any of your previous life, you still felt this attraction to, like, ornamentation and clothing, that whatever
Yeah.
he's going through now has kind of lost that. Like he's moved to a less material place, or
Yes, that's the next bit. I was just gonna say, like, I think maybe that's tied up with not having a lot of possessions for a long time.
mm-hmm. But I mean, even when he was in the house, he would have liked to have had more clothes. He still made
Right.
ornaments to decorate his hair and stuff. Like he still cared, always noticed whenever, the other changed clothes. And
Do you think he stopped putting things in his hair?
oh, I think he probably did. I mean, I'm sure that when he came out and like his family recovered him or whatever, they probably cut his hair and, I mean, I think he actually talks about that.
Oh yeah.
I don't remember for sure though.
Piranesi cannot bear to have so many possessions. I do not need this, is his constant refrain. Have you ever felt that? Like you have too much stuff?
So it is a constant struggle for me because I am a person who's a little bit of a hoarder by nature, in that like I have worked in theater since I was really young, and I always love collecting things because you never know when you're going to use it for like a set or a haunted house, or you're making a costume, or you need something to go to Ren Fair, whatever. So I have kind of this like collector's instinct, but I live in one room. So I can only fit, and my room is so cluttered because I have 6 bookcases that just cover every single wall because like, I don't have the space to keep anything else. So my natural tendencies have been kind of curbed by a lack of space to put things.
Yeah, so you don't have a big storage unit full of...
I don't have a big storage unit. I have a little bit of a storage area, but that's already pretty full, so I've had to sort of curve my collector's instinct to be like, oh, I could use this in a play someday or something.
Yeah. I probably have more stuff than I need. Every once in a while I'll give up stuff. But my mom, she more of a hoarding instinct. So like every summer she would throw a month-long garage sale and try to get rid of everything that we haven't used that year. But then she'd go ahead and just buy another one the next. I mean, it was a lot of pathology for me. So I try to make sure that there's just a few things out. Mm-hmm. But man, I have ADHD, so there's any drawer full of miscellaneous
random stuff.
But yeah. I have so many postal work shoes that are like tearing up. So there's like, so if it rains, like my feet will get all wet. And I've just got those in a closet. Like, when am I ever going to need to outfit an army of people with 11 size shoes,
with some holes in them.
Let's see here. Piranesi uses the journals to help him learn who Matthew Rose Sorensen was. Piranesi has a strong dislike of money. Piranesi wants to say, "But I need the thing you have, so why don't you just give it to me? And then when I have something you need, I will just give it to you. This would be a simpler system and much better."
I mean, I will have to say I do have lots of thoughts about truly egalitarian societies because I studied anthropology. Mm-hmm. And egalitarian societies are almost always an earlier phase of like societal evolution in every culture, but they only are really sustainable between 80 and like 140 people. So when you have small nomadic or semi-nomadic groups, egalitarianism is basically the system that almost everybody uses, and it is considered a huge cultural taboo to hoard or anything like that a lot of times, because you're talking about survival, right? Like if somebody has resources and they share it with everybody, that's how you ensure that when you don't have resources, you don't die. And in a lot of groups like that, names of relatives and stuff are actually directly connected to like what you owe them when you kill a large animal or something. So in like Inuit culture, a lot of the origins for names for like cousin or mom or, uncle is what you owe them if you, killed the seal.
Wow.
And there's lots of semi-nomadic and nomadic cultures that have variations of that. But it seems to only work in humans when we're in social groups that are less than 140 people. 80 to 140 seems to be the sweet spot for that.
So is currency, does that start to develop if there's 200 people?
Currency usually starts to develop when you get sort of sedentary agriculture and stuff.
So even there's some kind of
trading cultures, system? Yeah, because so you've got we're gonna get too deep into cultural evolutionary stages here.
It's tangent time.
You usually have nomadic, semi-nomadic, horticultural, which is where you're starting to cultivate plants, but you're not doing sedentary agriculture. It's we pass through this valley every summer, and when we do, we collect some food, but we also are taking steps to reinsure a good harvest next year and stuff.
Yeah.
So that's horticulture, where you're doing some plant cultivation, but you're not doing sedentary agriculture. And it's usually when you get to agriculture, we've built permanent settlements, where you start to get stuff like currency.
Gotcha. Let's see. Piranesi decides to write a book about Arn's sales. Raphael teaches him how to find the path to the labyrinth. So once he knows how to do that, he goes to Manchester, finds James Ritter, and offers to take him back to the house. And that was kind of touching because Ritter wants to stay in the house, and Piranesi won't let him. He's like, you don't know how to eat.
Yeah. Because that is one thing that James Ritter he never adapted like Piranesi did, and was only getting fed off of fish and chips, that was being left for him by Arn sales and stuff. So, yeah, I understand why Piranesi Sorensen or Matthew Rose Sorensen hybrid would be reluctant to leave him there.
Now, did he teach Ritter how to do it, or is he
He says, I will bring you here anytime you want. So that implies that James can't do it on his own. Who can do it on their own is Raphael.
Yeah, I love that. They sometimes go separately.
Sometimes together.
Man. It's like if you live near a park. Sometimes you and your partner will go together. Sometimes they'll walk the dog by herself or whatever.
Yeah. And I like, that the way that they tell you so much about her without really telling you that much about her. They have a couple stories and stuff, but the fact that she finds the house peaceful and refreshing, the solitude is comfortable for her, even it tells you a lot about who she is, that.
Yeah. So then, let's see. I don't remember what the part was called. It's page 16 on my thing here. The body of Valentine Ketterly, magician and scientist. So he finds Ketterly's body and lays it at the feet of a statue of a man surrounded by snakes. So he puts it in a net. It's going to be picked clean by birds or fish or whatever. And then he'll move it next to the biscuit box man for his final repose.
I love this. This is such a perfect ending for Ketterly, in that Piranesi is doing his best to honor and respect Ketterly's body, right? This is what he would do for anybody because he thinks this is how you deserve it and treat people, which is great and definitely who he is as a person. And at the same time, it is the worst burn, the last thing Ketterly would ever want. But he's not doing it for that reason. He's doing it out of sincerely trying to honor his remains. But you could just imagine how much it would drive Ketterly absolutely bonkers.
God, that is great. The method of burial was interesting. In anthropology, have you come across anything like that where they separate the bones?
It's familiar to, or similar to Tibetan sky burials and stuff, where there are a couple cultures that do a version of this. There's also I forget what the name of the subsect of Indian culture that does this, but they have vulture forests where they leave the body until the bones are picked clean. But in Tibetan sky burials, they bring a body up the mountain and leave it until the birds pick it clean, and then they put the bones, sometimes until it's just completely dispersed and carried away, and sometimes they collect the bones and put them in an ossuary sort of situation or something like that. So
right, yeah, that's cool.
But there are definitely cultures who practice versions of that.
So next he talks about how he continues to look or like think about the statues for guidance and strength. And he thinks of one in particular. It is the statue of a man kneeling on his plinth. A sword lies at his side, its blade broken in 5 pieces. Round about lie other broken pieces, the remains of a sphere. The man has used his sword to shatter the sphere because he wanted to understand it. But now he finds that he has destroyed both sphere and sword. This puzzles him, but at the same time, part of him refuses to accept that the sphere is broken and worthless. He has picked up some of the fragments and stares at them intently in the hope that they will eventually bring him new knowledge. And so I think this is the one he associates with Ketterly. Is that right?
Yeah, I think so.
Yes. Yeah, I think of Dr. Ketterly and an image rises up in my mind. So that's interesting. Sword and sphere. Is that just because like he wanted the great and secret knowledge, but he like wasn't diligent or it wasn't possible?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just his whole approach to life, right? Like, he was so one-track, narrow-minded. As Arnsales talked about, he could only basically steal ideas from other people, but then internalize them as his own. And he was driven to find a thing at the cost of destroying himself and possibly the thing, you know. Yeah. I definitely... I wonder if that statue is a direct reference to any work of literature or fiction, like a lot of them are, because I don't immediately recognize it, so...
Yes, we'll get to it, but that is one of the criticisms of your one-star reviewer is, what are these statues all about? I just assume they're her original creation, or at least I did when I read it before I talked to you. So I'd never thought to like go find out if this is based on a real story or anything.
Well, I don't know that every single one is. There are ones that are definitely allusions to particular stories or mythologies, like we've talked about through the book, but that doesn't mean...
Mr. Tumnus from
Right, we got Mr.
Narnia.
Tumnus from the Chronicles of Narnia, we've got some direct allusions to, like, biblical stuff, and, you know...
Yeah.
But I don't think that means that every single statue necessarily is a direct reference. They could all be. She could have a reference that she was envisioning with every single statue she describes. But I also think a lot of them are just evocative, because this is supposed to be, or at least their sort of supposition about this world, is that it's sort of where all the thoughts of this world trickled into and left behind these statues as... So, this is literally like all human thought and imagination and storytelling, not just anything that was ever like a published novel or anything like that.
Right. Yeah.
So
if we think about history as a, I don't know, 200,000 year experiment, you know.
Right,
like,
where a lot of storytelling was oral and, you know,
yeah,
a lot
like
of
99%
mythological...
of it doesn't,
yeah,
hasn't survived to this day or whatever, or is changed into another form.
Well, this statue sounds so specific that it feels like she's referencing something. That doesn't mean that she necessarily is, or that I have a problem with it if I don't immediately know the reference. It doesn't impact, I think, your sort of experience of the story if you don't recognize a reference.
Right, which is the good way to do it, right? A Ready Player One type thing will like just say exactly what it is. Mm-hmm. I like a thing that doesn't rely on you having already seen that thing and been familiar. The blade broken in 5 pieces, that for some reason that reminds me of a tarot card. I'm not sure if there is one like that, but I don't know. It has that vibe to it.
Several there's swords is a whole suit in tarot, and there's lots of, you know, but it also has Like, the spear doesn't, but the broken sword has, like, Lord of the Rings parallels. And,
Mm.
like, again, it's not, like, any of these images are necessarily even just evoking one thing, but kind of, like, story tropes and ideas, right? So, the idea of a shattered sword shows up through a lot of fiction.
Yeah. Let's see. Then he thinks of Lawrence Arnsales. This statue represents a heretical pope seated on a throne. He is fat and bloated. He lolls on his throne, a shapeless mass. The throne is magnificent, but the sheer bulk of the figure threatens to split it in two. He knows that he is repulsive, but you can see by his face that the idea pleases him. He revels in the thought that he is somehow shocking. In his face there is mingled laughter and triumph. "Look at me," he seems to say. "Look at me." So, and this brings me to something that we can criticize in media, which is the idea that, like, a fat person is out here breaking chairs and, like, just reveling in their fatness,
Well, again, it's the cultural associations that we have with different things like beauty, what we consider to be unattractive, disability, fatness are all things that, like, we've historically used in storytelling. Like, every single Bond villain has a facial scar. Like, even the ones that you don't think of on the surface, right? Like, we put facial disfigurement as, like, an indication of villainy and stuff when there are plenty of people who've gotten injured and have scars that are not sinisterly trying to take over the world. Like, it's... And we do, in our culture, associate fatness, and it's been used a lot in storytelling as a metaphor for, like, greediness, laziness, insatiability, a dedication to physical pleasure. Like, a lot of negative traits we've used fatness to, like, metaphorically indicate in a lot of our fiction and a lot of our storytelling and mythos, and fat phobia being something that you're still allowed to attach, like, a moral judgment to, stuff like, if somebody's fat, it's a weakness of character or whatever, which we know is total BS, right? There are so many factors that play into your metabolic rate and how your body functions, and it is not, like, a signaling of virtue to be thin, or signaling like of laziness and sloth to be bigger. Like,
I'm thinking about, like, Nero or Caligula or one of these people that's, like, supposedly super decadent.
Right.
But if they have the right metabolism, they could be skinny and have gout or whatever, like.
Right. All those same habits and indulgences or whatever can be on a thin person, or, like, somebody can be larger for reasons that have nothing to do with any of that, right? But we have used it as a cultural shorthand, just like we use ugliness and disfigurement to indicate villainy. We've used bigger bodies to indicate, like, moral turpitude and self-indulgent pleasure and laziness and greediness and all of these kinds of things.
Yeah, and I think in this context, the idea is that a pope should be the ideal of a priest, and so thusly abstain, be, not be obsessed with wealth and presentation.
Or food or pleasure, or
because we attach the moral thing to gluttony and so on.
Like, their lives should be spare and spiritual and not indulgent and decadent, and all, which is contrary to the history of most popes. Like,
all fat really means in that context is that you can afford to eat when you want. A lot of food.
Well, and this is the thing that, like, plumper bodies until the modern era were usually considered the more attractive because of what it took. So whatever is considered beauty standards of a culture at the time is usually whatever is hard to achieve, right? So plumper bodies were the harder thing to have back when it was harder to get as many calories and if you worked for a living. And this is why until recently, fair skin, even before colonialism, which obviously supercharged this negative sort of association with whiteness and paleness being equated with beauty. But even before that, cultures that had no contact with, like, colonialism yet, like in Japan and stuff, still valued fair skin because it basically meant when most labor was physical labor that happened out of doors, tanness and freckles and stuff was associated with poverty. And fair skin was associated with you were able to spend all your time indoors, just like plumpness meant you were well fed and didn't have to physically exert yourself a lot, you know. Now, in the 20th and 21st century, when most of our work is indoors at computers, the opposite is true. Tanness indicates that you have time to either be outdoors doing leisure activities or money to go to a salon and tan. So tanness is valuable because that's what indicates wealth and leisure now, as well as like in an era where our food causes a lot of metabolic issues, we don't walk as much, which causes like heavy, you know, more weight gain and stuff like that. Like a bunch of our factors in our society are driving the average towards being heavier. Thinness is way more valued because it is the hard thing to achieve, right? Like whatever is hard to get and takes money and time to get is usually very tied into the beauty standards.
Okay, so this, his opinion of Arn Sales and this heretical pope here, could it be moderated at all by the fact that Piranesi had to be lean and work hard because, you know, he had to work for every ounce of food?
Well, plumpness has been in the past. There's also always been, like, in Western cultural storytelling, shorthand metaphors, an association of fatness with greediness, like, an overindulgence. So while bigger bodies have been much more popular in the past, and certainly, like, rounder bodies, there is always still, especially in men, like, significant, you know, size has been equated with...
Like, you're not walking, you're being carried around on a palanquin.
So even if that's desirable, it's still also a thing to, like, judge somebody for, right? Like, even if you wish you were being carried around on a palanquin and being fed, like, decadent treats all the time, you're still going to judge somebody else for doing that, right? Especially when you don't have it. And a lot of times, the power structure of the Catholic Church and stuff ensured that they were literally called the princes of the church, like cardinals and popes and stuff, or ensured that they lived like royalty when most of the population, you know,
yeah, and the idea of a heretical pope is like odd. Like there have been, like the history of popery is very interesting. But the thing that makes him like the Baron Harkonnen is that he like, and it's the perversity, like Arn Sales, like, I know I'm disgusting, but fuck you, you know, 2 middle fingers up. Like, I feel like he could have done that without making him fat, but, you know.
I mean, like we've talked about before, there is some, as much as I like this book and I think she's a very skilled writer, there is some over-reliance on what I would consider negative tropes. Like we talked about with Arn Sales being gay. And the only character whose sexuality we were really brought into the story at all. Like there's plenty of people we don't know what their sexuality is, and even if we do, it's not like relevant to the story. Not only is the only person we know for sure is gay bad, but his queerness is directly tied to some of his villainous actions, right? So just like the over-reliance on the queer villain trope to communicate something, I do think that, you know, it's lazy to evoke, like...
I would like to just briefly give George R. R. Martin some kudos on this, because he has a character in A Song of Ice and Fire. Is it Wemberley? He's a northern lord. He loves eel pie. Like he's really into eating. Like he's always eating. But he's a good guy, and I just love that. That's like, or Lord like Varys. He's chunky and like, but it doesn't make him a villain. You know, I wish we had more of that. Just like I wish we had more heroes that have facial scarring, you know, instead of
right, because like facial scarring usually only indicates that you've at some point had some kind of physical, like either an accident or a trauma, you know, like something's happened to you to scar
Yeah.
you. It's just an indication of experiencing something that was probably traumatic in some way, not necessarily a villainy. Heroes who
Right.
are actively engaging in conflict and stuff have just as much chance of being scarred as bad guys.
Yeah.
No, but the Song of Ice and Fire series, his whole intent was to take every major fantasy trope and invert it. So his whole goal with the series was to use every fantasy trope that you are familiar with from every high fantasy novel existing and subvert it. So he doesn't always succeed, but he does largely succeed, and that's why there's a lot of, you know, examples
That's why a lot of people like it.
counter examples to things. Yeah, no, it's why its stuff is so compelling, you know.
Oh, one of the most noble heroes in the book, Brienne of Tarth, is like canonically unattractive.
Mm-hmm.
She's not in the show because, you know, it's Hollywood and they have to make everyone pretty.
Yeah, and I mean,
Gwendolyn Christie is amazing.
Is amazingly gorgeous. If they tried, like, she is, like, by a lot of Hollywood standards unattractive, even though, like, come on. But
they don't let her wear makeup, you know.
Big.
Yeah.
Like, she's tall and she's broad. Gwendolyn Christie is an incredibly powerful figure. While she is gorgeous, that was also part of Brienne of Tarth's thing, is that she was mannish, you know, which is just, she wasn't dainty. But she is ugly in the books, and obviously Gwendolyn Christie playing your character means that that's, like, inherently, everybody's less ugly than the books. Because, like,
that's just all of TV and movies, it seems
I mean,
like.
that is all of, for the most part, yes, but, like, Tyrion Lannister is much uglier in the books.
Up. Like, from the beginning, he's unattractive, but then he gets his nose cut off.
And they have that battle, and he gets sliced across the face, but they didn't cut his nose off because everybody likes Peter Dinklage too much. And I mean, they soften Tyrion Lannister's character quite a bit from how dark
he straight up murders
goes.
a guy just to keep a secret.
I mean, he goes very dark in the books. Like, he might have started out at a better place than his siblings, but if we're using them as, like, a moral barometer, that's not saying a lot, right? But he gets much darker. He's much more ruthless in the books and stuff, and everybody just, because Peter Dinklage is so charming, and, like, just everybody, he's such a great actor, and he's so charming, and everybody wanted more Peter Dinklage and also didn't want him to be, like, as terrible as everybody else. They softened his character considerably, but...
Yeah. Oh, and two of the most beautiful people in that show are Bad News, his brother and sister.
A lot of the really beautiful people on that show are bad news, you know, because again, he was actively attempting to subvert most of the major fantasy tropes, and one of those that has been, like, so pounded in by Disney, but even before that, is that, like, physical beauty equates to moral goodness, and physical ugliness equates to evilness, which is just bullshit. Pretty people are not any more disposed to be good, and in fact, in certain circumstances, because there's lots of studies that prove the, like, societal benefits, that being beautiful gets you, they have, I think, a higher risk rate, because anybody who gets privileges has a higher risk rate of, like, craving more or expecting more than other people, you know.
I'm thinking of Patrick Bateman in American Psycho. Christian Bale, you know, he looks the part of the hero.
Well, but part of what's being commented on that, too, is the interchangeability of that yuppie culture, because he is he looks like everybody else, right? All the standards are the same. Everybody's trying to achieve the same thing, like be the same icon of this culture in the 80s and whatever, and so he is constantly mistaken for other people in his office because they are all essentially interchangeable. So one of the things they're talking about is not only that he looks nice and good looking and successful, but he also looks exactly like everybody else, so nobody can ever remember who he is.
Oh man, we're getting way off track, but
we're getting very off track.
Love that book. Let's see. He thinks of a statue for Raphael. In my mind, Raphael is better represented by a statue in an antechamber that lies between the 45th and the 62nd northern halls. This statue shows a figure walking forward, holding a lantern. It is hard to determine with any certainty the gender of the figure. It is androgynous in appearance. From the way she or he holds up the lantern and peers at whatever is ahead, one gets the sense of a huge darkness surrounding her. Above all, I get the sense that she is alone, perhaps by choice, or perhaps because no one else was courageous enough to follow her into the darkness. And there, nothing about how beautiful she is. I think this one is really well done.
Yeah. I mean, it's all about the inner self and not about outward appearances.
Yeah, the inner self.
Even the fact that the statue is no discernible gender. That it's about the spirit of the person and not anything external.
I will just say, to be that guy, she says she or he. There is a word that can do both of those things. It's called they.
Yeah.
Anyway. So yeah, he talks about how he knows Raphael more than anyone and loves her more than anyone. And this is where he says the two of them return to the house often, sometimes together, sometimes apart. He says, "Don't disappear," I tell her sternly. "Do not disappear." She makes a rueful, amused face. "I won't," she says. "We can't keep rescuing each other," I say. "It's ridiculous." She smiles. It is a smile with a little sadness in it, but she still wears the perfume, the first thing I ever knew of her, and it still makes me think of sunlight and happiness.
I love that. I mean, I love the...
It's gorgeous.
Yeah. I love the intimacy that is communicated between these two without it necessarily being at all romantic or sexual. Like, it could be, but it's not important whether it is or not, because the important parts of their intimacy are, like, something different than that. Like...
Yes. Yeah, she refused to give us what we, quote, what we want, right? Which is the heroes to kiss or hook up, get married. Like, we know that he loves her more than anyone else, and that's enough.
Yeah. It is not important what kind of love it is or necessary to define.
Yeah. I also just love that joke construction. We can't keep rescuing each other. This is ridiculous. Whenever that comes up, I like it. Let's see. When he's stressed, he thinks about the house. He remembers the exact shapes and where to turn. One night he dreams of the gorilla statue leaving its plinth and coming towards him. He hugs it and says how happy he is to be home. And then he wakes up and he's like, "I'm not home." And we're almost to the end. It began to snow. The low clouds made a gray ceiling for the city. The snow muffled the noise of the cars until it became almost rhythmical. A steady shushing noise, like the sound of tides beating endlessly on marble walls. I don't know how anyone could not like this book. Like, that is some fucking gorgeous language.
Very evocative use of language throughout this whole book.
I mean, that's just like a love letter to everything we've read, like maybe if you don't have a really strong visual imagination.
Yeah.
But
even
the
then,
house
I think
isn't
there's
as rich
a
for
beauty
you.
to the rhythm of the words and the word choices that hitting my microphone, that I don't think that you would need. Obviously, I think this is very evocative if you have a strong visual imagination, and I do. But I think even just the words by themselves are arranged in an interesting enough way that you wouldn't necessarily need that. But I'm dyslexic, so I see everything, so I can't tell you what it would be like to experience this without having that, so...
Yeah. Plus, it has a semicolon. I'm crazy for semicolons.
You like a semicolon?
Yeah.
You like a stop, but not a full stop?
Yeah. So then he walks the park until he sees an old man, and he recognizes him. He thinks of this statue. He is shown as a king with a little model of a walled city in one hand, while the other hand he raises in blessing. I wanted to seize hold of him and say to him, "In another world you are a king, noble and good. I have seen it." Man, if somebody said that to me in a park, I don't know how I would react.
It would depend entirely on the vibe, right? Because there's a way somebody could say that would be like really threatening and unsettling. There's a way that somebody could say that would be weird but not scary, and I think could be very nice even if kind of bewildering.
I think if I was a little stoned at a party, I would love it. But just random walking in the park,
random person on the street, maybe a little aggressive. Yeah.
And last he sees a hotel. Paper lanterns were hanging from the wires, spheres of vivid orange that blew and trembled in the snow and the thin wind. The sea-gray clouds raced across the sky, and the orange lanterns shivered against them. The beauty of the house is immeasurable, its kindness infinite. And that's it. It's like he brought his love of the house out into our world, and he's seeing the beauty here. And then just that sudden switch, the beauty of the house is immeasurable, as if its beauty is pouring back out into our universe. Through him.
Possibly
like he's
through
the
him.
avatar. Wow.
Also, if our world created that world, then it makes sense that it wouldn't be just a one-way. And obviously, if we can go there, then it's not necessarily just a one-way connection.
Yeah. Wow.
The two people who we got theories of the construction of the world from are both deeply flawed people in their own ways. So I don't know that we can take as gospel anything that they have to say about it.
Wow. So, yeah, some folks are disappointed by this ending. I think it's lovely. I don't think we need, like, his mom saying, "Oh, we missed you so much. Like, tell me all about," because we haven't met her in the story, right? It would be jarring to have to, like, get to know new characters.
Yeah, I think people want more of a resolution of, like, him being Matthew Rose Sorensen again, or, like, a conclusive happy ending, or a conclusive... But that is, I do not think, necessary for this type of story.
I just think for this specific story, that's not what Piranesi is looking for. He's looking for beauty, truth, connection. Meaning. He doesn't kiss Raphael, as far as we know. That's not what this story is doing, Like, I think it's true that we could get more from Raphael in terms of, like, dialogue, like
we
the stuff we get is
never have
beautiful.
anything from her perspective, or, like, even, like, a really in-depth conversation between the two of them that we're privy to or anything, so.
Right. I mean, even the story about the newspaper we get secondhand from Askell. So, yeah, but it's odd because Susanna Clark is a lady, right? As far as we know.
I don't think Raphael's vagueness has anything to do with the fact that she's a woman. I think it has to do with just, like, who her character is and the relationship that she has. This whole book is from Piranesi's perspective. We're in his head. So I don't think, the lack of... Yeah, I don't think there's anything... I will say the main three characters are men, but there's... The next most important characters are both women. So you got Raphael and Sylvia, like, as the next most sort of influential, discussed characters. So...
Well, I'm sure we'll talk about it a little more as we go through the one-star reviews. But
hey,
yeah,
I need to go through all the one-star reviews because you collected quite a few.
It's an interesting thought experiment, though, to be like, well, what if she had given the women more to do in the story, right? but I think what we get is pretty great.
I was gonna say, I think while Raphael doesn't necessarily have a lot of like quote unquote screen time, she makes the most effective, impactful moves of any character in the story, except maybe
Right.
Ketterly, because Ketterly initially traps Matthew Rose Sorensen there. But otherwise, all of the most active decisions that affect the plot are all done by Raphael.
And we hear about her well before we ever see her. She is just as smart as Matthew in terms of like she arrives early at the hall and like hides. Yeah, she has agency. Clearly, she's been spending 6 years looking for him.
Yeah,
is that right?
I was gonna say she has possibly the most agency of anybody in the book, except maybe Ketterly.
Yeah, fuck that guy.
Right, but like he makes a lot of decisions even for other people, right? And like she is possibly the only one who has as much sort of effect and impact on what happens.
Yeah. So, I mean, where does this book stand for you? Like, how do I put it? Like, if you were to try to sell a friend on it, like, and they wanted spoilers for some reason. Like,
I was gonna say, I'm bad at these questions because for me it would depend so deeply on like which friend I was trying to sell.
This is a hypothetical, ethereal friend that wants spoilers. So,
I mean,
like,
even that, it would be so tailored to the person and what I think would interest them about it. So it's hard for me to give a blanket. But, like, I understand what you're saying. This is my brain being too pedantic about specifics.
On this show? Could never happen.
Look, this is a thing that somebody asked me the other day what my, like, death row meal would be. And I went into 7 variations of like why that is like not what I think they were trying to get out of me is not actually what the answer to that question would be, and then like all the different possible answers. So like I'm bad at these kind of questions. I always want to do, my brain just works this way. But I would say that this is a really lyrical, poetic, imaginative, like little interlude of escapism. Like, it is, I think, a very easy read. I think a very quick read. And I think it's just, like, take a little visit to the house.
That's beautiful. Yeah, I don't know what I would say to somebody. I mean, it's unlike anything you've ever read, probably. It certainly was for me. It is a kind of a case study of a isolated person who finds beauty everywhere he looks and tries to share that love and appreciation with everyone he meets. He thinks the best of people, and yeah, he just wants connection, and he wants to share his love of the house for, with everyone. It makes me happy to think of Piranesi, both the guy and the book. And it also just brings up a lot of ideas and thoughts and we talked about cults, like we talked about art, anthropology, mental illness. I mean, just it's for how short it is and how narrow its focus is, it brings up all kinds of stuff.
Yeah.
All right.
It's a really, really neat little exploration. So.
Yeah. Man. All right, let's get into these 1-star reviews. So just to let the listener know, I thought 1-star reviews were silly. I didn't know why anybody would use them. But the good people of Threads schooled me and told me that you can use them to find out what you like, what somebody you respect doesn't like. That might be something that you like. They might tell you some things that might trigger you, give you a sign of things that you just don't want to read about. And for our purposes, there's a lot of insight into like where the author might have misstepped in terms of tropes. What a reader who maybe isn't like one of these people thinks they're not British enough to understand it. Stuff like that, just stuff you'd never would have considered. Like the first one, these are all Goodreads reviews. The first one, Local Peanut, says weird, which I love, and unforgivably boring, which is just, I mean, that doesn't mean anything. It just means you didn't like the book. But I love this. It's like reading my ATM receipt in Esperanto. Yeah. So many people thought it was boring. I read 755 of these, and that was probably
I didn't see that one. The first one that I have on here is from Nikki. Personally, I wouldn't mind if the author doubled the length of the book.
Yes, this is the one that I told you that I thought was like, I didn't like it and the portions were too small. Mm-hmm. You run across this sometimes.
Which is a weird feeling to have. And what they're saying is they think if you took more time to develop Piranesi's personality and what was happening and stuff like that, that like it would be better, but I don't agree. I also think that you fully understand Piranesi's personality by the end of this book.
The guy has amnesia.
I was gonna say, I think what they're feeling is that they actually want to know like Matthew Rose Sorensen, or they want to know, but like you know who Piranesi is.
Yeah.
By the end of this book, no problem. Also, we have somebody here talking about the author misusing the word labyrinth and referring
this one.
to
I'd like to read this in full.
Yeah, go ahead.
Because I made this mistake as well. Peace Jan says, the author misuses the word labyrinth all the time. A labyrinth is a sacred thing. We often walk it or run our fingers over it if it is small and meditate. There is a certain path, usually to the center, when the human mediates.
I think they meant meditate.
Meditates, yeah, okay. I was worried that was my own spelling error. Anyway, I used to walk a large labyrinth that ended when you stood in the center and looked up. There was a large cross hanging there. A labyrinth is sacred. What the book portrayed was a maze.
Yes, and this person is incorrect in that what they're talking about is called a labyrinth and is like a subcategory of, you know, it is a meditative device, it is a thing that's used, but it is not the origin of the word labyrinth, and it is not the primary meaning of the word labyrinth. I have the definition right here, so a complicated, irregular network of passages or paths in which it is difficult to find one's way, a maze, a labyrinth of passages and secret chambers, an intricate and confusing arrangement, a labyrinth of conflicting laws and regulations. And then the secondary definition is a complex structure in the inner ear, but that is also based off of the original meaning of labyrinth. And the word comes from Middle English, from French, from Latin, from Greek. So we're originally talking about labyrinthos, I can't pronounce Greek, but which is specifically coming from like the story of the Minotaur and the labyrinth. Yeah,
Theseus and the Minotaur, King Minos and all that. The funny thing is the house itself isn't a maze. Everything's laid out in a rectangular grid, but because of all the collapses and stuff, sometimes you have to go up and over, sometimes you have to go around.
I mean, they didn't say that it was necessarily like that organized. I mean, it is like the rooms, there seems to be like a fairly regular size, although there are a couple rooms that, you know, are bigger or different shaped. He finds the one room that's round and has the doorway that, you know, he goes to when he's trying to find a special place for Ketterly to do a ritual. So it's not entirely uniform and it's not entirely laid out. And then yes, the tides and the storms and the cave-ins have all caused more confusion, so you have to learn it like Piranesi does to know that if you want to get here, you actually have to go up through this floor and climb down through a hole or whatever. Yeah. But it is not built intentionally to be a labyrinth. It is not designed. We don't get any indication to be like complicated or tricky or misleading or anything like that.
So that one like was interesting, but fundamentally wrong, you know. So we can kind of discount it. But the next one we've talked about, the idea of making the gay character a bad guy. So I don't know if we need to read it in full.
Yeah, but basically stating what we have already talked about, that it's a lazy trope to equate villainy, and a harmful trope.
Yeah, this person, the last thing they say is, its use in this novel really marred my reading experience.
Which
and
I
for
can
me,
understand.
like that's a 1 star, right? If something so fucked you up that like you put it down, or you don't want to recommend it to people, like I can really get behind that.
Yeah, and I did get it, because when I came across, when they were first kind of diving into the first time that he meets, when he's calling him the prophet, and he's talking about like dishy boys and, trapping them there and stuff, and I'm like, ugh. And then when they go more into it later on, when you find out more about what he's done, and it's like, yeah, no, the villainous, totally amoral, selfish character is gay. Great. And again, she doesn't draw attention to anybody else's sexuality. So the only time she points it out is in reference, which this review does correctly say, is in reference to both him and connected to his villainy. It's not even just mentioned as like a, passive trait of his or something. That's not, it's mentioned in connection to him abusing people and stuff. So
yeah, this writer rocks. They say his attraction to men is strictly and repeatedly mentioned in the context of his being an awful person, and is treated as something lurid.
Yeah, and they're correct in that it absolutely is. And it did turn me off. I had a hard time with that. It didn't ruin the whole reading experience for me, but I can understand where it would. And I'm with you that that's like a valid response.
The next couple were bored, but like one thing that I saw in almost all of these, which was about hype, right? This book won awards. It won the Women's Book Award. It won like another one. I'm sure I have it written down here, but like it was shortlisted for the Nebula and the Hugo. Jess says, "What the fuck is everyone else smoking?" The boring thing, everybody says it's boring. Naomi, the plot meandered aimlessly, and the conclusion was so predictable and unsatisfying. So predictable and unsatisfying are a common complaint as well. I can see predictable. It's not a twist book, right?
Yeah.
It's more of a suspense, right? We think that 16 is coming to kill Piranesi or drive him mad. She isn't.
Yeah, I don't know that I ever really thought that, though. Because the book doesn't tell you that. That's like Piranesi's interpretation from Ketterly, who I think at that point the reader already doesn't trust as like a reliable source of information or whatever. So there's mystery about who 16 is. But I was never really thinking that 16 was a bad guy, even when...
And the other part of the conclusion is that he's rescued and creates a new life or whatever, goes back to his old life. Why is that unsatisfying?
Yeah, I mean, it is the classic, and this is where you could say predictable, but the Joseph Campbell, or, the classic story circle where it starts with you leaving home and it ends with you returning home but changed, like irrevocably. That's like the classic story circle. So
I'm thinking Robinson Crusoe. He's stuck on an island for a while. He arrives home. It's like it makes sense. I don't know why it's
but you
unsatisfying.
Can't fit in at home anymore because you are not the person that you were when you left, because your experiences have altered you. So yeah, it's not a totally shocking ending or a totally novel ending, but like we talked about, I think it is emotionally satisfying and the appropriate ending for this book. Like,
yeah. So this next one by Nicole W. This was really interesting to me. I read the whole thing. She's a teacher, and so like she was using this in her class. So it was a pretty good review. This book is ethereal and beautifully written. What bothered me was the heavy-handed literary, in quotes, references and attempts. The symbolism that was so obviously and yet purposefully obscure, and in my humble opinion, elitist. I hated how the book tried to make the reader, quote, piece things together, and was intentionally opaque about things like the meaning of the flood or the statues or the albatross. It felt really rich frat boy playing at philosophy to me. I have a degree in literature. I like classics and analysis and depth, and I found it somewhat insufferable. I get it, but not about this book. You know what I mean? Like, I have said all that stuff about other people's work, about the opera, you know, whatever. Like, I'm kind of a working class Joe, like but I've been exposed to some smarter books or whatever. I went to a decent school, you know, like I could have been a teacher. So I'm on the level with this lady, but were we supposed to piece things together?
I mean, we kind of touched on this earlier because when we were talking about the sword and the sphere, because I think I like the references because she is clearly referencing something either in her own head or something that really exists when she's writing this. Like, we know she's referencing some stories for sure, but I don't think it detracts any. She's not making you, like, put together Easter eggs to understand or solve the story, you know? Like, if you notice a reference in the statues, that can be interesting, but it doesn't affect the story. And in the way that she's just showing you these glimpses into, like, the whole vault of human imagination, you know, it doesn't... Piranesi doesn't know what all of these things are referencing, you know? It doesn't diminish their impact on him. In fact, in some ways, it leaves him open to ascribe these different meanings to them, which might come out of vague memories of what they're from, but might just be vibes based on, like, you know, what he gets from it. So I don't think this book is mocking you for being uninformed or dumb. I don't think it's relying on you understanding references for the sake of the narrative. I don't think it's trying to talk down to you. I don't think the language is like some people who are trying to write real smarty pants books will use like incredibly Baroque language for the sake of it, you know, like.
I mean, I'm thinking of academia in general, but also books by upper middle class people that know all these references and they're only really writing to other people from their set, you know, so they'll like rattle off French phrases and just assume you know enough French to get by, or they'll like talk about writers from 100 years ago. Like, that's rich boy playing at philosophy. Like,
right. And this is the kind of thing where, like, IQ tests in the 60s were sort of determined to be, like, inherently racist and stuff because they favored a certain type of knowledge background. So, like, on the IQ test at the time, it would say, like, which composer composed this symphony? And the answer is Brahms. But other answers that still got you points were, like, Chekhov, Mozart, and Shakespeare. Because even though Shakespeare was not a composer, he was a playwright, you're pulling from the same canon, right? Like, you're getting... So you would still get points for referencing basically that kind of knowledge background that you're talking about, like an upper class, you know, well-educated Western. And so that's when they were being used to sort of like... When people were mad about segregation and they were using IQ tests to kind of de facto recreate segregation and saying, like, hey, these questions, whether they were intended to be or not, because this could just be bias, right? Like, this could just be you writing from a personal experience. Because there was, like, another question on the IQ test at the time that said, like, if you found a wallet in a store, what do you do? And the options were, like, look for the person, return it to the cashier, like, find a security person, or keep it, or leave it there. And without taking into effect the racial differences in our culture of, like, a white kid taking a wallet to the counter and saying they just found it would be treated very differently from, like, a black kid taking a wallet to the counter that they just found. So their parents are probably more likely to tell them to just leave it there, to, like, not involve themselves because people are going to be inherently suspicious of them because of racism. Like,
And oddly, putting a moral test in the middle of an IQ test is very strange on its own.
Well, there's no real good way to measure IQ, right? Because the intellect we don't have all of the different tests that we have that are designed to measure intelligence in some way are all geared towards one type of intelligence. Yeah. So, like, I have a high IQ because I'm good at spatial reasoning, but that doesn't mean that somebody is not as smart as me because they aren't as good at spatial reasoning. But that is what that Mensa created test is geared towards, you know? So, like, it's a complicated thing, and I definitely understand the frustration with something like that. And obviously, everybody's experiences are their own. If she felt like that with this book, then she felt like that with this book. But I did not feel like that with this book. So
this next one just hits really quickly, like a bunch of beefs that people had. Teresa Vance. It took me approximately 150 pages or so to appreciate a plot or point to the story. I prefer a book to grab me sooner, or at least not be tedious to read, and the first 100 plus pages of this book was definitely that for me. Did you feel that?
No, I didn't.
Like there's those lists and the odd titles of chapters and things, or sections, the naming conventions. People complain about that a lot.
Yeah, there's definitely, I noticed in here some complaints about the random capitalization and stuff, which I think is obviously sort of a fundamental misunderstanding of what she's trying to do.
Right, we immediately understood that is like veneration, sacred.
Emphasis. It's...
emphasis.
Yeah, it's a way that he is in his own mind sanctifying something, giving it more importance, separating the divine from the everyday. But yeah, I did...
I think that it might just be a matter of taste. Like, they might not like Robinson Crusoe either, you know? The first 100 pages figuring out how to live on an island alone. Like, that's kind of part of it. We need to live inside his head. And
I didn't...
It takes a while.
Any of the experiences that they're talking about, I did not find this tedious. I did not find this, too academically dense. I was, like I said, I was very swept away in this. I think it's an easy read. I think it kind of takes you to someplace else, and, you know, but that was my experience with it. I didn't find it hard to get into. I feel like she immediately takes you into what she's doing. Like,
yeah. One thing I found a lot is people taking issue with certain, like, plot points. And sometimes a plot point may seem odd, but it's like the story depends on it, right? Mm-hmm. What do we say? Like, suspension of disbelief. So Piranesi, when we came across this as we went. Piranesi was so obsessed with the other and wanting to please him, I couldn't help but think why he didn't just ask to go with him. And that's, you know, it has to do with the amnesia. It has to do with the other being cagey and being a dick and not wanting him to go with him. So, like, changing subject and stuff.
Yeah,
probably.
I mean, I was frustrated by how much Piranesi trusted the other and assumed good intention by the other, but not in a way that I felt like... I mean, you're supposed to. And also, it's not a mystery to me why he wanted to please the other and stuff. We get from the jump that this guy is fundamentally lonely, even though he's not being eaten up by it in a certain way. You know, like, there is a beauty and a peace that he's found in the house that he tries to return to even at the end. You know, he's like, but he is very interested in people. He is interested in all the dead and wants to know more about them. He projects onto the dead body of a little girl that maybe it was supposed to be his wife because he is so desperate for companionship. So this is the only person he talks to on a regular basis. And I think that humans are fundamentally social animals, even introverts and stuff like that. We need human connection. We want the approval of our peers. So much of human behavior is about, like, reaffirming that we are in the same in-group with people. It's why we reflexively yawn when other people yawn and that kind of stuff. Like, and so this is the only person he talks to. He wants him to like him. He wants him to think well of him. He wants him to spend more time with him. These are very basic human drives. And while, yes, it is a little frustrating that Piranesi doesn't realize that he's being wildly manipulative and a douchebag for, like, the whole thing, I understand why it's happening, you know? Like, I get why he wants to both think well of this guy and have this guy think well of him. This is the only human being he has any kind of contact with.
And the next one, admittedly, fantasy is not my favorite genre, and I don't consider myself all that imaginative. This is a huge stumbling block.
Yeah.
Right? If fantasy is not your, favorite genre, you might not like this book. If you're not at all imaginative, this book will challenge you.
Mm-hmm.
But they did say something really interesting. In looking for the study that the prophet and Matthew were interested in, was it transpossession? She found an article online that describes this phenomena of reality shifting. So I'll put this link in the show notes. It was really interesting. It was like a study about people who meditate or visualize to try to like go to, we talk about going to your happy place, but this is more like, making yourself believe there's a other world that you
it's
can go
depending
to.
On how you think about it and how seriously you take it. Basically the attempt to either teleport yourself, your consciousness, into another world, another dimension, another place, or basically a kind of like intense visual meditation where you are, mentally taking yourself on a little trip through a different world that you like. And it's also very related to stuff like astral projection and stuff like that. But it's a thing that got big during the lockdown era of the pandemic. And I think when you were referencing it to me, I was talking about like, yeah, it's like astral projection for Gen Z, because it was like telling you how to get yourself into a suggestive state and then thinking yourself into...
I will say the closest I ever got there was in 2001. I got a book at the New Age bookstore about like how to train yourself to become psychic. And the closest thing that happened was I was meditating or whatever, and I felt like I was sinking into the carpet. Mm-hmm. But that was about it.
Well, and there's stuff like, teaching yourself how to lucid dream and stuff is very similar to this. But yeah. Also,
I envy those people.
I mean, I have a little bit of an ability to lucid dream, but just like I can suggest stuff. I can't totally like, and it's in that dozing stage,
The hypnagogic state.
Where you're like coming out of deeper sleep and you start to dream and you maybe wake up a little bit and then you decide you're going to roll over and go back to sleep and you start dreaming a little bit again. Like that's the frame of the time in REM sleep where I can sort of suggest things into dreams sometimes. Not always, but it also reminded me kind of, have you ever heard of the elevator game?
No.
So this is a thing, it's like Korean urban legend where if you get into an elevator and you hit a correct series of buttons and do a correct series of things, I'm not going to get into all the details of the elevator game, but the building has to have 13 floors. You have to go to floors in different sequence. If anybody else gets on the elevator, it messes it up. At one point, like, you hit buttons for one direction, the elevator goes the other direction. That's how you know you're getting there. A mysterious woman will step in on one floor if you're doing it right, but you can't make eye contact with her or talk to her, or something terrible will happen. But if you do this whole series of buttons and stuff right, you get into an alternate dimension that looks exactly like the world that you're in, except there's a weird red cross in the sky in the distance and there's no people around. And you can wander around this alternate dimension and then you have to get back in the elevator and do the reverse of it. And I think it's kind of interesting because it's a very specific set, and part of me is like, why do you want to get into an alternate dimension where everything's exactly the same except the lighting's weird and there's no people? But if you think about living in a city with like a dense population, then you can kind of understand why being able to get yourself to a pocket universe where there's no people, where you can just have some like solitude and stuff, would be a nice thing. But there's lots of kind of, throughout different histories and cultures, this kind of like projecting your consciousness different places, different times, different universes.
I would go to that pocket universe if there were dogs there.
From my understanding, you are the only visible life.
No birds?
I don't know. Like everything else, this is an urban legend that has iterated. So there's ones that are more scary and sinister, that it's like, there are ones that are less, so.
Yeah, I'm thinking of Silent Hill.
There's definitely, like, they've made a very bad horror movie based on this and stuff like that. And it was used in the excellent podcast Tanis. Oh, we should put
God, Tanis
tennis
is
on the
good.
list.
Oh, shit. I mean, podcasts are hard because you get such a tiny sliver of the story.
I mean, we're talking about doing X-Files next, and we're doing 3 episodes out of like 7 seasons worth of content.
Yeah. We could probably find a few good Tanis episodes that, if not standalone, like are big, like have, powerful images or whatever. That fucking cabin in the woods, man, terrifying.
But yeah, so it's the idea of being able to somehow manipulate your consciousness into being in another plane of existence is, I think, a pretty old and universal one that gets new iterations all the time.
Yeah. So this one person says, when everything is capitalized, then nothing is actually important. So you might as well just write normally anyway. They missed the point.
Says the person using like 5 exclamation marks at the end of.
I feel your pain, James. But they do also mention a book called Circe. So I wonder if somebody recommended this book because it was like Circe. Have you read Circe?
I have not. It is on my list. It has been recommended to me as well, but I have not read it yet. Have you?
That's not what I wanted. No, I haven't. I was trying to find the writer's name. Circe novel. Madeline Miller. It's got pretty good reviews. We might want to take a look at some point.
No, I've heard very good things about it.
So Java says it reminds them of a Star Trek filler episode where the crew's in an alternate dimension reality, collective amnesia. I'm thinking of the one with Beverly Crusher where she has this great line where she's like, if I'm not crazy, then it's the world that's crazy. Do you remember that episode?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. That's the episode where Wesley is experimenting with making a warp bubble, and she gets trapped in the warp bubble, and then everybody starts disappearing one at a time because she's in this, like, warp bubble, again, talking about, like, pocket universes. And because she was thinking about Wesley growing up and getting old and like leaving the nest when she got trapped in here, everybody starts disappearing until she's alone on the Enterprise by herself and she has to figure out why everybody's disappearing. Also, one of the things that, like, because whenever anybody disappears, nobody else remembers that they existed, right? So she keeps arguing with people about, like, so really this ship that's built for like hundreds of people is only assigned 5 officers. Like, it's just us. We're supposed to operate this whole thing. And they're like, well, yeah, but I have to say that episode always really got to me because it was very similar to a reoccurring nightmare that I had as a kid. Which was my whole family was going to a house for a vacation. Like, they rented a house in the woods somewhere, and people kept disappearing one by one, just like in that episode where, like, you'd turn away and then, or they'd be gone, they'd go to another room and they'd disappear. And the scary thing, just like that episode, is that nobody would believe me that people were disappearing. I was like the only one who was able to perceive that people were disappearing. Nobody else remembered them once they were gone, and I couldn't get anybody to believe me that people were vanishing from the house, and it could be any one of us next. So that episode stuck with me.
That is freaky. And you said that happened more than once?
Oh, yeah. I had like 4 reoccurring nightmares when I was a kid where I would have either the exact same dream or variations of the same dream regularly throughout, like, the, not more than like once a month or something, but I would have them. They would happen multiple times when I was a kid. I don't have any of them anymore, but I did when I was little, and they were all very scary.
Well, I think it might behoove us to have that as like a one-shot sometimes. Like, if we don't feel like doing a larger series, just hit that Beverly episode.
Yeah, it's a good episode, I think.
Yeah,
it's a really interesting take on the bottle episode. So
I found a good Vox article about Piranesi, and they had this good quote. Within the house, Piranesi was able to apply his limitless empathy to the statues that surrounded him, to all the rock and stone and water that comprised his world. In our world, the empathy the statues trained in him leaps out of him to strangers. He knows that a sad and tired old man may also be a king, noble and good, because he learned as much from the house. So yeah, Vox seems to have taken a similar thing that we did, like that the power is coming back into the world from him.
Mm-hmm.
That was kind of cool. That was a little positive interlude in the midst of all this.
Yeah, I was going to say, how
tragedy.
many do you want to read of these? Because there are a lot, and I feel like...
I'm going to skim and see if there's any important negatives here. Let's see. It's really funny when people like have all these positive things to say in their 1-star review.
Mm-hmm.
This person liked the capitalization. Joe Chang finished this book out of spite, and I applaud you, madam. That's brave. One person says, if you like that one Tom Hanks movie where he's talking to his volleyball, you'll like this.
I don't really feel that there's much connection other than isolated survivor to this and Castaway. Like,
no, there's no 16 of any kind.
There's nothing mystical happening of any nature. Like,
also, Goodreads reviewer, you're on a computer. You could find out the name of that movie. Let's see. The whole transition Piranesi went through from gaslighted research assistant to victim trying to escape didn't make me feel anything but contempt for Piranesi being so oblivious. So a lot of people had this complaint, is that like, Piranesi dumb. I don't like.
This is the kind of thing that I feel like people do this all the time where they'll like, and some of it's just human nature, whatever, right? Where you yell at a horror movie, right? Like, don't go in there, don't do that. And I think a lot of people are speaking from a position of not having experienced a lot, because I don't think anything he does here is particularly dumb. I think if you were actually to apply it to your life, right? You're researching a book. You go and talk to the people involved in the book you're researching. Somebody who you think is an outsider thinker but a crackpot wants to show you the ritual they did to get to another world that's directly relevant to what you're writing about. If you have no indication that he can actually open a portal to another world and trap you there, anybody would let you do that, because like you don't think it's real. Like, most people would let, I mean, there's a small subsect of people who have enough, like, superstitious thinking or whatever that they wouldn't let somebody, like, cast a spell on them or whatever, right? But if you were doing research for a book that was directly about that, you would 100% let them do it, because you want to see what they're doing. You're going to write about it. You need to understand their methodology and stuff. I don't think any of that is dumb. By the time he literally closes his eyes and he's in another world, it's not like a swirling portal opens and he just steps through it guilelessly, you know, like.
Yeah. I'm trying to think about what this problem is. I think it's like people come to a book and they just have a fundamental misunderstanding of what the book's trying to do. You know, it's trying to achieve a thing, and if this other thing isn't done, that whole story will fall apart, you know? Like, if you can't accept that Doctor Who has a magic wand, you're going to hate it.
It's a sonic screwdriver, but sure. Right, but you have to be willing to meet any piece of media on its own terms, right? Like, and I think that there's a lot of people clearly not willing to do that with this book, which is fine. Everybody's allowed to like or dislike whatever they want, and if this isn't, but you're never gonna get the full experience of something if you aren't willing to meet it on its own term. Like you said, if you're not gonna buy into the fact that he has a ship that's bigger on the inside, that looks like a telephone box, and they're a regenerating Time Lord who's thousands of years old, you're not going to enjoy that show. It's not going to work for you, because you're constantly going, well, this is clearly bullshit.
Mill just says, like a Doctor Who episode, but 10 times worse. What were you going to say?
No, I just wasn't going to say anything else on that. Just that, like, yeah, if you aren't giving this, like, an honest if you aren't willing to meet the book on its own terms, you're not going to like it. But that's true of anything. And that also doesn't mean that somebody couldn't be sincerely trying to meet this book on its own terms and still not dislike it, because you totally could. But a lot of these people aren't even willing to engage with the premise. Like,
yeah, this might be my favorite. Matthew Manchester says, maybe I'm too unlearned or not British enough to understand why this book is so great. That one, like, encapsulates the elitism, the, like, obscureness, and, like, the hype, right? All in this tight little sentence. People hate the hype. And it really blows me away. Like, but I know I do it too. Like, if I go see a movie that's making millions of dollars and people are raving about it, oftentimes it doesn't work for me. But then I don't rush to, moviereview.com or whatever to, like, say I didn't get it. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, obviously there's a tendency that lots of people are going to not like something just because it's popular, right? This is the whole pumpkin spice latte, Taylor Swift, whatever argument, right? That there's something in, especially a group of people who like to feel like they have very unique or specific tastes or superior tastes or whatever, think that if anything is popular to the masses, it has to be inherently bad. Instead of the idea that something is popular to the masses because there's an inherent goodness about it, right? Like,
yeah,
if Taylor Swift couldn't write a song, she doesn't have to be anybody's favorite artist, because there is a level of, like, generic, pop to her stuff, because she is trying to reach a large audience that might not make
and she's also using all the, like, equipment of the music industry to take her song idea and make it, like, the best it could possibly be in this narrow, like, at least with the big hits, like,
right.
It's kind of narrow.
You're trying to engineer it to hit all of these points and stuff like that, to something that, like, a pop song hit needs to be. But yeah, like,
but this book was never going to be a hit. Like, it's bizarre that this kind of book almost won all these awards, right? Like, this is not the kind of, like, mainstream killer that you, like,
but awards darlings are different than mainstream killers, right? Like, most of the times the Oscar bait movies or whatever are not the biggest box office draw of the year, right? Like, that's part of the thing I think that people are responding to in this. And I wasn't really aware of, like, the marketing or anything like I don't know how this was being presented to people when it was first presented, but there's clearly something where people are getting, like, a intellectual superiority condescension from this book, which I don't think is a fair criticism of this book, but, like, I don't know how it was being presented to people. If it was being presented as, like, then there's a lot of inherent anti-intellectualism or, like, kind of response to it, which is what a lot of these are giving me.
That might be what's behind this one. Heather, this book made me want to fight a bear. That was it. That was the whole review. Here's a funny joke. I'm a statue of a man looking unimpressed, holding a book and shrugging. All of those words were capitalized. One person claims that Susanna Clark stole a bunch of ideas from her book that was on her website. That's pretty fascinating. I sent an email to her. Maybe we'll get more. Stay tuned.
I mean, that happens with literally any successful property of any kind.
Yeah. And the idea that literary agents are, like, combing the internet, rounding up a list full of ideas, and this handing it to their client.
You traditionally publish and stuff, they basically demand that you don't engage in fan culture and fan communities and, like, read any fan fiction or anything like that, because they don't want anybody to have any grounds that you stole their idea. So if you're, like, writing sequels or a writer on a TV show that's ongoing or whatever, you are not allowed to, like, read fan fiction or anything, because if you do, somebody could argue that you stole their idea, even if it's, like, a completely obvious place for the story to go, or, like, and that's the thing, there are only so many stories in the world, right? And any story that anybody can find similarities between something they wrote and something that somebody else got successful with, and some people are always going to feel, you know. But yeah, that happens with literally any successful property, is people sue for the idea being stolen. And so
It's
I think
really
a lot
big
of those
in
people
pop songs, like
genuinely
there's-
believe it. Like, it's movie scripts is one of the biggest ones, because
Yeah.
so many people have tried to write a screenplay, and even if they've never like put it anywhere or done any, you know, like if they see a movie that has the same idea that they had, which is not like a totally surprising thing, right? Because a lot of these can be so vague too, you know, like what, again, there's just this one thing that reminds them of their story or whatever, and they're like, oh, they stole my whole idea.
I mean, this person had like, I read it like 15 specific, very specific things, but even that has happened. Like 17 people wrote about a ship crashing in the North Atlantic that was really big and a bunch of people dying, and then it happened. You know, like there may be something just weird going on in the human brain that exceeds the limits of time, you know, like what do they call it? The Akashic record, the collective unconscious. So I think it's silly to assume malevolent intent. Somebody says high quality literature needs to be accessible. That's just provably false. I mean, War and Peace, you know, whatever. Like some books are 1,000 pages, you know.
But accessible doesn't mean that it's short, or accessible can mean all kinds of different things. Like, again, that's, again, not everything's going to be everybody's vibe. So, like, what this person is defining as accessible might not be what somebody else defines as accessible. Like I said, I found this a very easy read. It was very easy to drop into. It doesn't, like...
I'd like to run it through one of those tests that tells you, like, the grade level. Because I think sometimes a person is just used to reading at a 3rd grade level, and this one's vocabulary is at a 5th or whatever.
Well, I mean, unless they define what they mean by accessible, then we'll never know if they're talking about.
It's like boring. It's just, it doesn't mean anything without more context. It's not good for my reviews, folks. Somebody thought it was written as a scientific journal. Here's a good problem. Evil white guy enslaves a person of color, drives him mad. Then when the person of color has a chance to leave, he chooses to stay with his enslaver. That's not exactly what happened, but it's close. I mean, so I could see it as a legitimate critique, is that this white lady wrote this story where the black guy is victimized.
Yeah.
He ends up coming back to the place.
I do agree that there is something that I think she's clearly trying to play with about gender and race and power in this book, because most of the people who are victimized are women or people of color, right? The people who disappear are Sylvia, and the people who get, you know, James Ritter is gay. Like, a lot of the people who are taken advantage of in this book somehow are in some way a minority, right? Like, that's, and the people who come out okay for quite a long time are 2 white men, even though they reference like Mediterranean features in Ketterly, right? He's still got like a but I do feel like there's something she is trying to play with that she never really fully resolves, and I will give that as a valid critique, because she kind of seems to invoke it and then never really does anything with it, you know? Right.
Yeah. That sometimes drives me crazy in a Doctor Who story or something. Like, you brought up something super important and like could use a lot more depth and nuance, and you just sort of skirted your way past it. West Wing did this all the time.
Oh yeah. Well, Aaron Sorkin's a master at that. But like, yeah, so I definitely could see a complaint of it feeling like she's going to deal with something in this that's sort of implied by the subject matter, and then she doesn't ever really deal with it. I don't quite agree, like you said, that's not quite an accurate summary of it, because Ketterly never, like, offers to let him go.
Right.
And he chooses to stay with him. That never happens. You know, he
literally, in the last chapter, chooses to return.
Yeah.
Sometimes with her, sometimes alone.
I think what they're referencing is when, like, right after Ketterly is killed and Raphael's like, come home, and he's like, no, but for me, for somebody who's experienced like PTSD and stuff, you cannot just yank somebody straight out of an environment that is the only thing they know and are comfortable with. And this again goes to Raphael's sort of understanding of people intuitively, is she tells him her perspective. And that, like, I've been looking for you. Your family wants to know what happened to you. I would like you to consider doing this. But she doesn't drag him out there, which would be very traumatic. Like, he makes the decision with her encouragement to leave, but she doesn't force him to do anything. And he doesn't know anything about the place that he's going to. He's only gotten chaotic flashes, which is scary, you know? Like, she is being very respectful of his needs. Like, I could see it if, like, Ketterly offers to let him go. And he chooses not only to remain, but to, like, still continue to aid Ketterly's mission. But that's not what happens.
Yes, that would be weird, too, because the book is about this traumatic upheaval. You know, everything's leading to that point. Mm-hmm. I feel like she really structures it so that flood is like, you know, just massive, yanking someone out of their equilibrium.
Yeah, but she does seem to evoke the idea of, like, racial imbalance and stuff, and then doesn't do anything with it.
Yes.
So.
Somebody thought the dialogue was unnatural, cheesy, and forced. Did that come across to you at all?
No, I mean, I could see what they're saying in the fact that the way Piranesi speaks is not colloquial contemporary English. He speaks in a fairly flowery way. But again, this is a guy who lives in his own head. Like, I don't think anything that Ketterly or Raphael or anybody who isn't living in the house says sounds unnatural.
Yeah.
He's living in an unnatural circumstance. Even his earlier journals, or when we get in the flashback of him being Matthew Rose Sorensen, he speaks in a very normal way.
I think the closest thing I could see is that Raphael being this good angel, they might see that as cheesy, right? She's sincere and earnest. But, you know, sometimes the character is sincere and earnest. But that's all things that people are capable
of being. Yeah, that's not... Yeah. No, she doesn't speak in a way that's unnatural. She speaks in a way that anybody... It doesn't seem like of a different time period or out of place. You know, it seems very... Like, she's a sensitive, intuitive person, but she doesn't... The language she uses is very spar and very colloquial and normal. Like, you know, normal is a weird thing to say to anything. But, like, yeah, I mean, it would not be out of place on any, like, contemporary street, you know?
Yeah.
So... I think the only person whose language might seem odd is Piranesi, and that's because Piranesi is in an odd circumstance. He's not in a normal environment. He's not in a peer group. He's in his own head. He does, you know.
Well, and like I tell people when I'm trying to sell them on this book, you have never met a person like this, right? Mm-hmm. So, of course, it's unquote unnatural because this is something new. You haven't seen this guy before.
But you have no idea how you would construct language in your own head if you had all the information that you had now, but no memory.
Right. Yeah. So
much of our speech patterns and stuff is informed by the people we talk to every day.
Yeah. Sanskriti, this is the last one. Something as serious as being kidnapped and left in solitary confinement for years elicited absolutely no anger or sadness or joy, literally nothing, from Piranesi. And I just wrote, this is absolutely wrong.
Yeah.
It made me so mad I wanted to go into the book and pull out every example.
I was going to say, hard
put on this person's review.
Disagree.
Whew, man, I got heated.
Yeah. He gets scared. He gets worried that he's losing his mind. You can tell that we weren't there for him, with him during the time when he was first experiencing fear and anger and shock. But he wrote, I'm going to kill him. You know, like he wrote all caps cutting through his paper that
What about when he has the total meltdown and he's like, no. Like,
yeah.
Oh.
This person is just incorrect. That's not true.
And no joy? Like, he lives in a state of joy.
Yeah, I think that, no. That's just not right. It's just incorrect. You didn't read it right. I'm sorry. I try not to be prescriptive about these kind of things, but that's just a lack of media literacy on your part.
Yeah.
You could say a lot of things, but that he experiences no emotional responses is not one of them.
No, absolutely not. All the hype, a lot of people said Emperor's New Clothes. I assume that's just a thing that comes around all the time. Let's see, they hated the dating system. It takes too long to grasp the plot. We talked about that. Unoriginal. It's hard for me to fathom that. Like, I can't think of. Maybe other people have read books like this. I hadn't. Mm-hmm. So that one drives me nuts. Would work better as a video game. I actually love this idea.
I don't know that would work better, but would be an interesting video game. Yeah.
Yeah.
I actually think in certain ways it kind of, what's the name of that video game? There's an aspect of What Remains of Edith Finch to this. If this were a video game, have you ever heard of or played that game?
I haven't.
So you are exploring an old house, and you are getting glimpses of what happened to the girl that lived there before through things that are left in the house. But it is in the way that very like Myst, actually. This game would be a lot like Myst because you're going through empty rooms, empty chambers, trying to understand. You're reading people's journals and like traces of things, but so there's definitely a precedent for this kind of storytelling in video games, and I could definitely see it making a good video game.
BioShock is a lot like that. There's this like evil industrialist that leaves his tapes all over. I heard about a game called Dark Amnesia that somebody here said was similar. Let's see. Somebody felt misled. They thought it would be more about Greek mythology. I guess partly because there's a faun or satyr on the front page. And there's statues. I don't know.
The cover art does look very Greek mythology related, which is, I think, probably why if somebody was getting recommended stuff like Circe off of this, that is like a Greek mythology connection. That's a straight retelling of a character from the Odyssey, telling like from her perspective, from what I understand. Okay. I haven't read it, but that is what I'm given to understand about it. And the cover art does look very Greek mythology related. So, there is a satyr.
I think if there had been direct references to Greek mythology, it would somehow be less accessible to maybe people who aren't from Western culture or never read about Greek mythology like I did at age 8 or whatever.
Yeah, I don't really feel like this story is dependent on outside knowledge. Almost more in the British sense than anything else. Because I would understand, the one commenter was like, maybe I'm not British enough or educated enough for this. I feel like the most specificity comes out of the British references. Like, if you aren't familiar with British brands and stuff like that, that is almost more alienating than anything else. Because nothing else is referenced directly. It's all just alluded to. And we've all heard stories, and every culture has mythology. I think the fact that she isn't attaching it to one specific one makes it more sort of inviting and easy to get into, but I don't know.
Yeah, the last two are sensible. Someone was disturbed by the girl who was maybe meant to be Piranesi's wife. They felt like that was problematic. And a white author writing a black man getting saved by a cop. And we've talked about that. Yes, it is a little awkward.
Well, also, cops are the people who save people in a lot of our stories, regardless of the relation to real life that has. Yeah. Like, in stories, cops are the person who's going to be looking for somebody for 6 years if they go missing, And I mean, it is, of course, possible to write that story with that being, like, Matthew Rose
she was
Sorensen's
a private investigator
or something.
Or, sister,
like, even
a researcher.
Friend, colleague, whatever. There's ways to do that without making it a cop, and that might be a little bit more A, realistic, and B, palatable. But, like, cops are the people who save people in our stories. And yes, I absolutely agree we should start writing stories where we stop depicting cops as more competent and dedicated and driven than they actually are in real life, because it gives people sort of a false idea of law enforcement. But, yeah.
I would like to hear from any Black folks about that sort of thing, as well as gay folks, anybody who feels like some of these tropes are not for them or weren't adequately delved into. Because obviously I'm straight, white, cis, hes, het. Like, there's gonna be things that that I miss as we cover these different properties.
Yeah. No, absolutely. If you ever feel like this is, because I am also white, I am biracial, but I'm very white presenting and get treated as white in the world, I am queer, but I'm cis. So, yeah, that's a whole thing we could go down, of the fact that I am half Mexican and I am perceived as white by, like, the entire world. So,
man. Wow. Okay. A couple of news items. Someone says a stop motion film is being made. I looked it up. It's on IndieWire. It says Leica announces new stop motion Piranesi.
Oh wow, I love Leica.
Yeah, they're a Hungarian animation firm.
I mean, I just saw the 15th anniversary screening of Coraline literally yesterday, which was Leica's very first feature-length film.
Wow. Ooh, the writer of that one's gotten into some mischief, huh?
Yeah, Neil Gaiman, but Leica has not had anything,
yeah, of course. He was beloved back then. That's fine. Won the Women's Prize for Fiction. There's a Guardian article about that. And then I just wrote down a list of all the similar vibe books that people referenced in these reviews. You've got The Starless Sea by Aaron Morgenstern, The Midnight Library, Circe. I found 4 different books by Jorge Luis Borges.
So, yeah, he's an Argentinian writer who, yes, definitely a lot. When you were talking about never having really read a book similar to this, I was like, clearly haven't read Borges, because he was obsessed with the Labyrinth and he wrote a lot of stuff with this kind of vibe. So, yeah.
Nice. We've got Why Weeps the Brogan by Hugh Scott. The Magician's Nephew, C.S. Lewis. I already mentioned Robinson Crusoe. Another Neil Gaiman, The Ocean at the End of the Lane. Have you read that?
I have read that.
I couldn't get into it. I got about 50 pages in.
Yeah, but I can definitely see how somebody would clock these as having like a similar feel.
Okay, cool. Anathem by Neil Stevenson. That's the guy that wrote Snow Crash.
Yeah, I've read Snow Crash, but I have not read that book, so...
Okay, I couldn't finish Snow Crash. What did you think of that one? Should we add that to our list?
I mean, cyberpunk, yeah. It's basically the foundational text of cyberpunk, so, as a genre.
Yeah, I always think of William Gibson's Neuromancer.
Yeah, I definitely think that would be in the, but I think, I'm not sure, but I think Snow Crash predates it. I think Snow Crash. Okay. I think Snow Crash is considered like the originating work. Like Frankenstein is considered the first science fiction novel, although there's some debate about that. I think Snow Crash is like the original cyberpunk text. But
cool. If you would like to read the work by that lady who thinks that Susanna stole a bunch of her ideas, it's called My Adorable Apotheosis by Kirsten Hacker. Let's see. I'll run down a bunch of these. Alice in Wonderland, The Secret Garden, The End of Mr. Y, The Matrix, Naive.Super. Have you heard of that?
I have not.
Amnesia, The Dark Descent. That's the video game. Gormenghast, the author Calvino. I haven't read any of their works. 10,000 Doors of January. Something called Crossings.
Oh, The 7 Deaths of Evelyn Hardcastle. Interesting. I like that book a lot. I would not have instinctively put it in the same category as this book. But I can see where they're coming from. But to me, it has very different vibes. But there's an aspect of figuring out what's happening in media res. Like, you get thrust into a character and you are trying to figure out what's happening while they're trying to figure out what's happening. That I could see that parallel with this book.
Okay, cool.
But I do think it's a very good read.
Cool. Is the main character Evelyn Hardcastle?
I'm not going to tell you anything about that. That is a book. Let me tell you, that is a book that you should go into with as little information as possible. It is
Cool.
the most fun if you know as little about it as possible. Actually, a friend of mine gave me that book as a Christmas present, and she stapled construction paper over the back so that I couldn't read. I mean, obviously I could have taken it off, but she didn't want me to even accidentally catch any like blurbs or description about the book on the back, because she was like, the less you know about this book going into it, the more fun it's going to be. And I fully agree with her. So I'm not going to tell you anything more about the 7.5 Deaths of Evelyn Hardcastle, because if you're interested at all, you should just read it.
Oh, it's 7.5?
Yeah, I think so.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I had 7. That Hideous Strength. Have you heard of this?
I have not heard of that.
It's a C.S. Lewis book. I haven't read it, I don't think. It's one of his science fiction books. I've read Paralandra, also titled Voyage to Venus. But I haven't read that one. Let's see. House of Leaves, we talked about covering that.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe after X-Files, or we definitely have it on our list. That's a weird fiction.
I flat out said we should have a break between Piranesi and House of Leaves because they are too similar. Different, very different reading experience, but in certain aspects too similar that we should put some space between them.
Too similar. The Raw Shark Texts?
Have not heard of that.
Texts? The Raw Shark Texts by Stephen Hall. Let's see.
Maze Runner. Yeah. I mean, definitely very labyrinth-based, so...
Oh, check this out. Eric Sanderson wakes up in a house he doesn't recognize, unable to remember anything of his life. Interesting. The Maze Runner. What is The Maze Runner? I hear people talk about it
The
sometimes.
Maze Runner is a dystopian young adult series of kind of a bunch of them that sprung up in the wake of the success of the Hunger Games. So you had Divergent and The Maze Runner and a bunch of other series that were trying to sort of capitalize on that mood vibe. So it is young adult dystopian, very similar to, like, they wake up in a maze. There's a bunch of teenagers wake up in a maze. When somebody dies, a new kid just appears there, wakes up there overnight. There's like an elevator. They're trying to make their way out through the maze. It's very inspired by the original Theseus Minotaur story, right? Because they're like sacrifices in a maze. They try and make it out of the maze every day, but they have to be back by nightfall, so they can only go so far because they die if they're not back by nightfall to their like center clearing area where they live. You know, you get more into it and there's government conspiracies and all kinds of stuff that's happening, but that is like the basic premise of the story.
Gotcha. So it sounds only tangentially related.
Just in the fact that there's a maze and the character wakes up not knowing what's happening, what's going on, why he's there.
Yeah.
But otherwise it's much more similar to something like the Hunger Games than it is to Piranesi.
Which is fucking great. I just reread The Hunger Games.
I mean, The Hunger Games, they were a phenomenon for a reason. They're incredibly well-written books. Like,
and the last one is Samuel Beckett's Endgame. It's an absurdist tragicomic one-act play. A guy and his companion in a abandoned house in a post-apocalyptic wasteland.
Mm-hmm.
So there's some similarities there. And then also I came across, apparently there's a genre called dark academia.
Yes.
And now I want to know everything about this. I find that immensely fascinating.
Yeah, so the parts of this book that would be dark academia would be like Aaron Sales kind of forming a cult of students and leading them to break in and do weird rituals with bog bodies and stuff. That would be the part that's like dark academia-ish, you know.
All right. Well, hey, let's give the listeners some homework.
Mm-hmm.
You're going to learn Esperanto and read your ATM receipt.
That's learning a whole language, a lot of work, but we have faith in you.
I just scrolled back up to that one. Oh man, sometimes people will put some words together and it's like, this has never been said before. Oh man. Well, I love this book. I'm sorry those people didn't have a great experience, but I sure did. And tell your friends, tell your family.
But if I would recommend it, as we talked about. I think it's a really fun, interesting read.
It's only 240 pages.
Yeah, like I said, I think it's a very easy to slip into, carry you away, over a weekend kind of book.
Yeah.
So.
And if you do audiobooks, the narrator is just incredible. Just really
isn't
beautiful.
The narrator
mellifluous voice.
What's his name?
Is it Jefferson Mays? Or is that a different guy?
I think the one I saw had...
Oh, Chiwetel
Ejiofor, yeah.
Yeah.
Who has just an incredible voice. Such a great actor and such a beautiful voice, so...
Yeah. Well, we did it. We completed our first property. We are fully on our way.
We're moving.
I feel like confetti is coming down. There's like party horns.
Yep. So if you are interested in joining us onto our next property, we are talking about X-Files. And we talked about that when we do a show, we're going to always do the pilot and then pick 2 episodes out of it. I mean, maybe if it's like a mini series or something, we'll do the whole thing. But something like X-Files, Doctor Who, Buffy, shows with just a vast amount to go through.
Right, yeah.
We're going to do
I'm thinking Silo has 10 episodes.
Yeah, I think we could probably do Silo.
But yeah, these 20, 30, 40, no, of course.
Things that have been on the air since like 1960, like Doctor Who, we're going to pick up, so we're going to do the pilot, and then we're each going to pick an individual episode. And my individual episode is going to be Humbug. And I think you said...
The circus one.
Yes.
Or the freak show, yeah.
And I think you said... Last time we talked, you were leaning towards Beyond the Sea. Is that still your pick?
Beyond the Sea, yes. Where Scully sees her dad in a dream or a vision or something.
Yeah. And it's part of why I picked Humbug, because you were picking a heavy mythology episode, so I figured I would pick a Monster of the Week episode to really give us the range of X-Files episodes, because they're the ones that sort of tie into the ongoing overarching plot, and then there are the ones that are just like the monster we're investigating for this episode.
Yeah, it's interesting that they're season 1 and 2. Mm-hmm. Maybe we would come back to it at some point. And
we can circle back around, but I do kind of tend to stick in the first 5 seasons, because as we discussed after like David Duchovny decided to leave the show, but not really decided to leave the show, the writing gets kind of muddled. But the first 5 seasons are some of like my favorite television I've ever seen. So,
hell yeah. Well, listener, we've probably got some social media sites. They'll be on our tiny URL or in the show notes. We may have a Patreon by the time you're listening to this. But definitely send us an email, greatandsecretknowledge@gmail.com. Mm-hmm. And be a part of the action.
Yeah, let us know your thoughts about Piranesi. Let us know your thoughts about X-Files if you have any,
Yeah, and if you've never read Piranesi, I'd love to hear what you think, even if it's bad. Yeah. I just want to know.
We're definitely not above criticism or people disagreeing with us, so.
That's right. So would you rather do Rex first and then our plugs, or plugs first, then Rex? I've done it both ways.
Yeah, we did either way.
Let's do recommendations. Do you have anything you've been grooving on the last couple of weeks?
I think I already talked about, because I've still been binging a lot of Dropout TV, a lot of game changer and
Yes.
make some noise, because it is my stressful, busy season at work, and so I do not have the energy to engage in a new plot or anything. So, just enjoying some fun, lighthearted comedy with that. Let's see. I think I know it's not a new recommendation, but I'm going to re-recommend it.
I mean, it's good, you know.
Haven't partaken really of any new media this week, so
yeah, I found a great podcast called Bookburners. It's like a bit like a National Treasure, Dresden Files kind of thing. It's
interesting.
I mean, technically, it's just somebody reading a story, but like the music is beautiful and like the characters are really interesting. I listened to the first two. The main character's name is Sal. I think it continues with her and the Bookburners group, but I don't know for sure. I can't remember where I heard about it, but it is great. Definitely, the first two episodes are good. Oh Boy, a time travel podcast. Oh my God. They covered the only 2 seasons of the new Quantum Leap, which was great. It was just going to be that, but then the show got canceled. So they're like, we love doing this. So now it's all time travel, and they've done all kinds of stuff. They did Back to the Future this week. They've gone all over the place. And then James Lark, who is putting together a song for us.
Ooh.
I said, like, you know, when we're ready, if you'd like to come on and talk about something, is there anything that you would be into? And he said the Bartimaeus trilogy. Yo, I read the first one. It's called Bartimaeus. Let me just double check. The Bartimaeus trilogy. Oh, it's called The Amulet of Samarkand. And it is fantastic. It's like a little bit of adventure, magic. It's like a more thoughtful, grown-up Harry Potter without any of the baggage or negative behaviors.
Interesting.
Nominative determinism and all the other silliness of Potter. But yeah, it's fantastic. I highly recommend it. And I think that'll do it. So let's do our recs. You want to go first? Or no, not. I mean, our
plugs.
Other stuff.
We just did our
things we do. Yeah, plugs. That's what they're called.
Yeah, you can find me on my Instagram at Lindsay Cameron Nelson, where it is almost entirely my gelato. But if you're interested in seeing the new flavors and the new themes, you can find me there. And then I do Cool Breeze Over the Mountains, which is a Keanu Reeves filmography podcast. The Kurt Locker, which is a Kurt Russell filmography podcast. And Historical Hotties, where you can go listen and find out the hottest historical figures of all time.
Hell yeah. So I started, this will be more relevant in October. So remind me to tell the listener that there's a very special date coming up. But my first podcast, Everything is Awesome. It's an arts and issues kind of discussion interview podcast. I still do it every once in a while, but I mean, I interviewed and hung out with writers and comedians and musicians and, I don't know, a few newsmakers, journalists. There's 100 and some odd episodes, so please check that out. If you know somebody that's been on the show, you might listen to their episode, or if you are interested in a particular topic. We did a great episode on depression, a couple on Black Lives Matter. So, give that a look. And then my current podcast, Shattered Worlds RPG. We've been doing it since 2017. It's a space opera, actual play using a game system I developed. And it's got robots and zombies and spaceships and wizards and all kinds of silly stuff. It's a comedy podcast. So if you think I'm funny at all, you might enjoy that. You can find me online everywhere at El Jefe Tacoma. And I just set up a Facebook page for the show. Eventually we'll have maybe a Discord or a Twitter, maybe. Sure would be nice if Elon would sell that thing and everybody could go back to normal. But yeah. Did you give your social media handles?
Yeah, the only thing that I'm really regularly on is Instagram. I do have a Twitter, which is Lindsay Nelson, but I am very rarely on Twitter these days. So my Instagram is the best. I do have a TikTok at Noctisphelia if you want to see my TikTok video.
It means darkness's daughter.
Yes, it does.
Hell yeah. I think I need to get more active on Instagram so we can communicate and spread the word about this show. And yes, please, listener, tell your friends, get involved. This show, we're going to do word of mouth. I don't know if we're going to be doing any I don't know. What are those things where you spend money to advertise?
Ads?
There you go. That's what they're called. Probably not going to do too many of those, but yeah. So we need your help. Review us on your platform of choice and spread the word.
Yep. Reviews are always super helpful algorithmically to help new people find the show and stuff. Plus, we always like to hear what you think.
Yes. Even the 1-star reviews can teach us something.
Sure.
Just don't any of you write those.
But I'm sure we'll get them. They're inevitable in life. Some people are always gonna not be digging what you do. So
they made it through 6 episodes to get to this point.
Is always wild to me. Yeah. Like you were saying in those reviews, when people wrote reviews that sounded basically positive and then gave it 1 star, it's like the people who are hating something but continue to listen. Although I have to give them props for at least trying to get a decent sample before they review,
Yeah.
Because if you listen to one random episode, it could always just be that episode.
Oh my God. Shattered Worlds. If you go to season 1, the sound quality's a little bit janky. A lot of talking over each other, I didn't edit as tightly back then,
I love some of the subject matter of some of the first Historical Hotties episodes. Like, we did con artists and recluses and some of my favorite categories. But the sound quality we definitely improved. Let's put it that way.
Yeah. But now we're seasoned professionals.
Yes, we have multiple podcasts.
I've listened to these episodes. They sound great.
We have good mics, not Blue Yetis.
Oh, fuck.
Where
nothing against
everybody
you, Blue Yeti, but...
I mean, that's where everybody started that I know, so you're the gateway into podcasting, but... Echoey as I'll get out in this room, so...
Hell yeah. Well, we did it.
Huzzah.
What do you think?
Yeah.
All right. That's it.
Thank you for joining us as we went through Piranesi.
Yeah. One of these days we're going to get an awesome end.
We're going to get a sign off. We're going to get an intro phrase. We're going to get a sign off, and we're going to do it all the time.
That's right. I wonder if there was a quote from this week that would suit. What about the last sentence? The beauty of the house is immeasurable, its kindness infinite. Cue the theme.
I made a gesture that was not audible, so that's a great podcast move right there.
Perfect. Perfect. that was that went perfectly, just like
No
we
notes.
scripted it.
10 out of 10.